Hello and welcome back to Dishelved with Adam White. Today we're going to discuss a book of poetry. It's called I Would Leave Me If I Could. It's by Halsey, who is a musician. Uh, she's done such albums as Manic, Badlands, and Hopeless Fountain Kingdom. Badlands is probably my favorite. It's got songs like Castle, Hold Me Down, and Hurricane. Um, but she did a book of I liked her music, so she came out with a book of poetry. Thought I'd check it out. My sister got it for me last Christmas, and it's a pretty good book of poetry. So for the first time of doing poetry, I thought I'd start with one that's a little off the wall instead of a more traditional poet. I want to read a poem called Due Date. I was born 5 weeks early. I couldn't wait to join the rest of the world, and that is exactly the moment my enthusiasm ceased. The nurses tried to take me so my mother could sleep, but she refused to let me go. I'm sure ultimately I ended up in a common room for newborns, and I'm sure ultimately I lay there comparing myself to the other babies, wondering if I were as smart as they were, or as funny, or as beautiful. The average baby weighs 8 pounds. I weighed 5. The average baby is 20 inches long. I was 14. And it was on my first day on earth that I realized I didn't measure up, and I never would. Of course, with a name like I Would Leave Me If I Could, uh, you're probably not going to get poems that are all sunshine and unicorns. Uh, so there's a lot. The book's not for kids. Let me say that this review has nothing, uh, uh, no dubious content in it, but the book itself is definitely not for kids. Um, she just has a lot of adult themes in it and some language and stuff like that. Uh, it's an interesting book. Um, Again, I get this backwards thing down here. Uh, she did the artwork on the cover too. It's just a bunch of people's head spaces, parts of heads. Um, she talks about on page 2, if I can find it real quick, about a beautiful woman in a car crash, shiny asphalt and smoking rubber, melting plastic and metal edges, glimmering glass, shrapnel iridescence scattered across the road, haphazard beauty, dignified and slightly terrifying. Um, that's kind of how she defines beauty in this. It isn't just the traditional sense of beauty, but it's a terrifying thing, like a car crash. Um, she thinks other girls are better than her. She has somewhat of an inferiority complex, um, like you got in the sense of that due date poem. And that is a theme that goes throughout the whole rest of the book. And excuse me for I'm having to check my notes a lot here because poetry takes a lot of uh, you got to really pay attention to what you're talking about when you do poetry. But so I'm going to be consulting my notes a lot on this one. Um, she's dissatisfied. Um, what she wanted to be was forbidden to her, it seemed, a lot as a young woman and child. And she says, can you hear the silence of being alone, the deafening stillness? Uh, you get a sense that as a young person, she was alone a lot and didn't have anyone to look up to. And this deafening stillness, which again is always a good metaphor to use. She, as in due date, never thought she'd measure up, that she was unworthy of the world, um, that she was a worthless smudge on the floor. These are all quotes from poems in here. Uh, she just never felt like she measured up to other people, and the other girls were always smarter than her and prettier than her, and um, just had it more together than her. Um, she said there was a suicide in my body, which is more of a death of the inner self instead of, an actual suicide. Uh, I never got the sense that she actually attempted suicide at all. I think it was just, again, more of again, the suicide inside my body is what she says. So it was more of a death of self, that she wasn't sure what she was, and that um, she would have to kill off what was inside her to become something else. Um, she met with all her issues and hide them so people would like me. She says that she had a lot of problems growing up, and she felt that she had to hide all of that in order for people to actually like her, or like her music, or uh, have anything to do with her. She talks a lot about uh, things like gasoline and kerosene, basically combustible things. And she talks about things that aren't quite as obvious as that, that are combustible as well, and that her attitude is combustible, and that her life is combustible, and she really could explode at any moment. And it's a really interesting metaphor for her life. She also talks about illusion, um, watering plastic plants and expecting them to grow. She mentions that a couple of times in here, um, about how it's just kind of a useless gesture, because it doesn't matter if you water plastic plants, they're not going to grow. They're going to stay the same no matter what. Um, you think that they will grow. She also thinks that every guy is special until they show their true colors. Um, Not a lot of good relationships in this book of poetry. Uh, a lot of, quite frankly, terrible relationships between her and other people. And you get the sense that she resents the men once she's done with them, because of all the things they made her do and the way they made her feel about herself. And it goes back to her not measuring up, and she always wonders whether it's her fault or the guy's fault. Um, she talks about watermelon a couple of times, and seeds, and how they always told her as a kid that the seeds would grow in your stomach if you ate the seeds. So she was always scared and was spitting them out like crazy. Um, it ties into her saying that something wants to claw its way up out of her throat, the way that the seed would grow. Um, there's also um, that she would explode from the inside out, and things growing from the inside out, and that she constantly had to spit things out, and that things were growing inside her and forcing them way out of her. Um, and again, that could be a metaphor perhaps for her music a little bit, and something that comes from the inside. Uh, but it was always something that was growing inside her, trying to get out, and it wasn't always a positive thing. Um, Let me get back to her here. Um, on page, she does this poem called "Wish You the Best," which is anything but. It's one of her more humorous ones in here, where she's telling a guy that she wishes him the best, but that everything she wishes him is terrible. So it's a really good poem. Uh, I think there might have been a few questionable things in that, so I'm not going to read it. But um, it it was really funny because of the title being ironic to the actual content of the poem. She always is talking about looking in a mirror. She does not like what she sees. She fears it. She hates her reflection. She says it doesn't feel like her. Again, that's part of her never measuring up. Uh, it's a way of her looking and at herself as something other than what she is. There's always this sense of other in this book of poems. She doesn't like what she sees. She feels that she doesn't measure up to her own reflection, that it's not what she sees when she thinks of herself. Um, Another one I want to read to you, The Breakup. It's a short poem. There is no combination of words in the English language that slice right between your teeth with the perfect paradox of hate and love the same way as I love you like a brother. So it's kind of like let's just be friends, but I love you like a brother. That's just another of her short little funny poems. She does have some humor in here. Most of it's pretty serious, but she does have a few that are funnier like that, and like the "Wish You the Best" and this "The Breakup." She has some long poems that are maybe about 3 pages long, and then shorter poems that are a page to page and a half. Um, it's easy to get through because, again, with poetry, you can read just a little bit at a time, or you can binge it like I did this one. Um, she also has a thing about drowning and breathless imagery, like she's having trouble breathing. Um, she feels like she's been swallowed whole, that her heart climbs into her throat, and that she can choke on your name. All things that uh, are about being breathless and having trouble catching her breath, and that things are choking her. Also, not something that's really great to happen to you, but it's an image that appears in here multiple times, and she really gives you that sense. And it goes back also to the seeds trying to claw their way out, uh, and it ties into that as well. But she's always left with this just sense of breathlessness that even when she looks in the mirror, that she just doesn't measure up, which is all comes back to that. Um, 8 is the name of a poem. It starts in innocently enough, but ends up being something more sinister. It's about a relationship with a mailman, just as her as a kid, and he would give her gum and ask her questions and things. And then it turns out to be something a little more sinister at the end. So I mean, even the poems that start out good, with the exception of those few humorous ones, um, always end up being something more than that. She has a few song-like that I thought sounded like her songs, a little more rhymey than some of the other ones. Those were Tertiary, Guts, Fun Girl, and Forever is a Long Time. She talks also a lot about taste, salt, sweat, sweet and sour. Um, a lot of it all the time. She just suggests things have a taste to them, whether they're physical things or not, but even like mental things have a taste to them. And she also has a lot of stuff that's tactile about touch. Um, and we won't go into a lot of that, but she has a lot of that imagery in there about uh, touching things and being touched, and uh, it just, she ends up with some really interesting metaphors with that. Uh, in the poem Everything, you get the sense that um, she grew up poor, and then later she had everything. Not everything, but everything compared to what she did have. But you find that she's empty, even though she has all these things that she didn't have as a child, that she still feels empty, and she still looks in the mirror and doesn't see what she thinks she should see. Uh, and you get a lot in that one. She says, I can't take this anymore. Again, it's that suicide of the inside. She needs to change who she is in order to survive. Again, I don't get any sense, like some poets, of actual suicide or suicide attempts, but it again, it's this killing off of the inside of the person that she is. Um, she also mentions sticking an arm down your throat and grabbing your heart. Again, that goes back to the breathlessness and how it cuts straight to the core of you with your heart. And that's what a lot of this gets to in this book. She really has everything that goes straight for her heart in terms of she doesn't know how she feels about certain things. And feeling is always connected with the heart. I know technically it's the brain, but in especially in poetry and imagery, the heart is where your feelings come from, and she feels that every time something grabs her heart, it's not always in a good way, and it ends up leaving her breathless, and uh, it just goes straight for her heart and grabs it, as opposed to, uplifting her heart or making it light. It's kind of a darker thing than that. Something also that I think that's very interesting is her sense of longing versus having. And she talks a lot about when she's young, longing for certain things over the course of her life through her teenage years, and then later as a musical artist, having those things, and how having them sometimes uh, isn't as good as the longing for them. That sometimes it's kind of like, be careful what you wish for, because, and I think that there's a lot of that in here, this longing versus having. And I thought it was a really interesting examination in here. Uh, Fame and art is a symbiotic relationship. You take things from it, but it also takes things from you. And that's another that kind of goes in that longing versus having, is you have the art now, but whether it's the poetry or the music, but it also takes back from you, and it takes something out of you. And again, it leaves you feeling not uh, the way you want to sometimes. And again, that you look in a mirror and don't recognize what you see. Uh, so again, I think it was a very good book of poetry. I like her music as well. I highly recommend it. Uh, Again, it's not for kids, but I mean, it's not super bad, but um, she just really has it. Um, she's having an adult conversation through poetry about what makes you you, and what uh, having things can take from you as well. So I've run a little bit long on this one. Poetry also always has a little bit more to talk about, because it's themes in poetry as opposed to just kind of what the story is, and so on. So I hope you've enjoyed this poetry one. I'm going to be doing more poetry in the future, and I thought I'd start with something a little offbeat in terms of poetry. And I really liked this book. I Would Leave Me If I Could. Again, you know it's not going to be all happiness. But sorry, my computer kicked off and started a screensaver there. Uh, but everything is interesting in this book. Good book of poetry. I'd recommend it. Uh, anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this talk on poetry, and I will see you next week.